It was, yep.
And so,
big drinker.
When did you start drinking?
My first drink probably when I was about 5 or 6.
But your first drunk?
5 or 6.
My first drunk was probably when I was 6 or 7.
Wow.
And
Really?
I was hanging out with all the boys in the neighborhood, out in the field between our houses and on Beaver Pond. There was nothing better to do at that time.
Beaver Pond.
Yeah.
The irony.
Yeah, I know.
Where is this? Where is Beaver
In
Pond?
Bridgeton, Maine.
Bridgeton, Maine.
And I was hanging out with boys maybe a year older than me and older. And they were just getting into stuff that what boys were doing at that time. They were like, stealing beer and liquor from their parents, and I was just hanging out with them. I was one of them at that time. And so I started smoking pot like probably within 1 year of starting to get drunk. I was smoking pot probably at 9 years old, and which I am horrified to think of a 9-year-old, because I'm my age now. I just think, oh my God, I can't even imagine an 8. I'm on my niece, who's now 21, was 8 or 9. I was freaking out thinking that she's going to be doing what I was doing. And so I knew as a very, very small kid, I couldn't wait to get older to drink. And so when boys in the neighborhood started to drink, I felt like I was a drunk before I ever drank, even as a kid. I couldn't wait. And what it did for me at the time is it made me feel like one of the boys, and it made me so that I didn't feel different from them. And when I was sober, I felt different from them. I felt like I was the same, but they knew that I was different. And so as I got older and I started to develop as a girl, I started to really feel separated from them. And drinking didn't really work to fix that anymore. But I kept drinking. And by the time that I was 21, I was exhausted from drinking.
So you're very similar to me. We were discussing this last week of later stage alcoholism. Of some of us get it younger. Some of us just, there's something in us that we don't have those extra 20 to 30 years that we could drink. Yeah. It wasn't like it was, when I was 22 and I got sober, I really couldn't drink anymore. Like it was doing nothing, and I almost couldn't put it in my body.
Yeah, I was exhausted.
Yeah.
I was emotionally exhausted. It's really funny. I had a friend, her name was Meg. She was sober, and she was sober maybe a year and a half at the time. And she called me on a Sunday morning. I was on the 3rd day of a hangover. I was a mess. Wow. I was laying in the dark in my dark bedroom, all the blinds closed in Portland, Maine, Amy's favorite place. And I was nursing the 3rd day of a really bad hangover. She calls me, and I pick up the phone, and she says, "Hey, I'm heading to a meeting. Do you feel like going to a meeting?" And I'm like, yeah. It was the first time in my life that I was I was totally weirded out. I had no idea how she thought I might like to. Why did she call me? How did she know that I might? I really had no clue. And it wasn't until, I'm not even kidding, I was probably about 14 or 15 years sober that I actually figured out how she knew. I was such a mess on the outside to everybody else. Everybody could see it.
Right.
And that's why she asked. But it took me so long. And when I would say that in meetings, it was funny because I would say that and people would laugh. I'd be like, I don't know why they're laughing. Why is it? But
we talked about that a lot actually last week, that, it's amazing people that are using that think they're getting away with it.
Right.
Yeah,
They think
Right. Well, it's like the people. It's the people that drink vodka
Yeah.
that think they don't smell from it.
Right.
Somehow you're hiding it because it's like who started that myth?
That vodka
doesn't smell.
Probably a vodka company.
Right, because it does. And we could
Smirnoff started that.
Yeah, Smirnoff. Right. Smirnoff started that.
or Poland Spring.
When I was a tweaker, I didn't think anyone could tell. And years later, everyone's like, "Oh my God, we knew."
Right.
You were.
We can still tell now.
You were
Right.
vibrating, Amy. You were vibrating. It was so obvious. Not just even being gray or whatever, but you don't think anyone knows. And then there's also a point where you get to where you don't care if anyone knows.
Yeah, you cross that line.
There's that
where-
point where you're like, hey, then at one point when I was shooting coke, I would wear short sleeves.
Which I think is the bottom. Which I think is the beginning of the bottom is. Peter Gabriel has a great line in one of his songs. It's "Watch my in Salisbury Hill," where he says, "Watch my empty silhouette." And I remember when I was drinking, walking around, I could almost see this mess I became.
What an arcane reference.
Yeah, well, it had a profound
I'm sure
impact.
everybody listening was like, "Yeah, I totally thought."
Right? It actually had a profound impact on me because when we're drinking,
Judah?
I think there's a part of us where we could see the mess we've become. We get a moment, we get a glimpse of ourselves to the mess that we are. At least I did personally.
I was about 30 years old, and I'd been injecting cocaine for about 13 or 14 years at that point. And I remember one day, it was like the middle of the day, and I stopped work. I was living in a hotel room by myself. And I stopped work, and I went and got a big bag of cocaine. I went back to my hotel room, and I started injecting cocaine. And I had this epiphany, and I thought, I remember this clear as day. I thought, if I'm not careful, I could have a problem with this someday. I'm not kidding. and then I sat there thinking how slick I was to have that foresight. Wow. You know what I mean? So then I switched to heroin. And that worked out. Just not the way I planned.
But there's that thing. It was like I remember the point where I was like proud of the fact that I was kind of strung out and I was a junkie. And then there's that weird part where people are starting to notice and you're ashamed. I remember my parents had shipped me to Santa Fe because I couldn't get clean in LA. And I flew back to LA from Santa Fe, and I had to go through security. And the way that they looked at me in security with track marks and all skinny.
Terrific.
And I just felt like this deep, deep shame. And I'd become one of those people that I used to look down on. I was like, oh my God, I'm that now.
Well, what I think is amazing about your story too is like it started really late for you.
Yes, it did show. Yes, it did.
Yeah.
When I hear you're like, oh, you had your first drunk at 6. That so blows my mind. I wasn't drunk till I was 19.
We're gonna go out for a break again here in a second. Come back, listen to KLEAN Radio. It's Andrew with my co-host Judah once again.
Yeah.
Tonight we have the comedy troupe Laughs Without Liquor, Ian Harvie, Felon OReilly, and Amy Dresner.
So when are you guys going to be performing in LA? Because I want to hear you.
Ooh.
I think we might be doing. It's not definite, but there's talks about doing something for AALA. In April or May, and I'm not sure which. We have a tour manager, which we want to give a great shout out to Sal Ianello.
Woo, Sal.
So
Thank
awesome.
You, Sal.
And he takes really good care of us, and he's been in talks with several people about different little things. We'll let you know for sure, but all details always on our website at laughswithoutliquor.com.
Yeah, and on the Facebook page too.
And if you're listening, you can reach us at 877-830-830. Taking calls from our listeners. Last week we had a call from someone who said they had a friend that they thought had a drinking problem, and they didn't really know what to do. And often I think about people out there that don't have a problem themselves, but have a friend or a family member.
I think it's the hardest thing in the world. I think it's one of the most powerless feelings. Is being a friend. We're all sober in here, and we all have had friends that are drinking or relapsed, and to me it's one of the hardest things in the world, because what do you do?
And I see a lot of family members that are just very angry.
I mean, it devastates. Yeah. I mean, me and Amy have a friend in common, who has had a hard time with sobriety, and it's one of those things you don't know. It's why you don't know what to do.
Did any of you have family members intervene? Did your family?
I had an intervention. There was actually about a half a dozen ATF and FBI
agents. Were they compassionate?
They were not.
They were not. No.
But one time I was watching that show, Intervention, and with my roommate and his girlfriend, and this guy on the show was shooting heroin. And she said to me, what do you think when you watch that show? And my answer was, whenever I watch that show, I wonder what it's like to have a family that cares that much about you. That would actually do an intervention.
Wow.
You know what I mean? But I mean, I was, I'm old school, and back then, people didn't know about addiction back then. People didn't know what to do with people.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like people thought I was just crazy.
Which I think is the amazing thing of today is that we are starting to open up more about it. Even doing a show about it is, because there's so we always assume because we live in LA and you and I have spoken about this, that everybody knows, because we're surrounded by like 1,000 meetings a day, but there are places, where I come from in Brooklyn where they don't know anything about addiction.
Right.
There's that local AA meeting that they still, that they see, the motorcycles, the people smoking cigarettes, and the people with coffee, but they don't know what's going on inside.
Well, there's a lot of stigma, not just to addiction, but to mental illness.
I had interventions.
You did?
Yeah.
How did those go?
Yeah, who was there? What'd they say? Like, what was the style?
I had a couple.
What
They weren't
style?
even necessarily interventions. I mean,
You
I started,
remember?
I started doing crystal at 24 in San Francisco, and I never had a drug problem, and I'd never known anyone who had a drug problem. So I didn't really know the signs. Even myself, I again had that moment I remember where actually other friends of mine, I was living in a house with all these gutter punks and skinheads, and we were all tweakers. And I'm like this Beverly Hills Jew, in Lower Haight. And this one guy said to me, you should really be careful because you could have a problem with that. And I was like, And 7 months later, my whole face blew up from an infection. And I remember calling my parents, and I said, I'm really sick, and I need you to come get me. And they came, and that was the first time they found out about it. And they were absolutely devastated. My father cried the entire drive home. And they moved me back to L.A. because I'd never been a drug addict in L.A. And they thought they did a geographic. And
there's no drug addicts in L.A.
They didn't think I would know how to navigate the system and find contacts or whatever. I'd never been, high in L.A. So they moved me back to L.A. and I drank for a couple months. And then, I found one tweaker and I was off again. And
So you were basically tweaking for close to 16 years.
No, I was a tweaker for a year and a half.
And then what do you?
And then my dad was trying to get me into rehab, and I refused, and they were afraid to cut me off because they were afraid that how I would support myself. And I walked into a market, and I woke up in an ambulance, and I'd had a grand mal seizure for the first time in my life.
How old were you?
I was 25.
Wow.
And I was really freaked out by it. And my dad said, you ready now? And I said, yeah. So I went into a dual diagnosis residential treatment center for 2 months, and then I went into a sober living for 4 months, and I stayed clean for about a year, and then I tried to drink, and that didn't work out too well. I was in a blackout for about 3 weeks, and then I stayed sober for about 7 years. And I lived abroad, and then when I came back, I wasn't doing program or anything. And then I
By
relapsed.
program, you mean AA?
Yeah, and then I relapsed. I started smoking pot because I'd always hated pot, so I didn't think it'd be a problem. And I started drinking because I thought I was really a tweaker. And then I started doing coke. And then, within 6 months, I was back in rehab again. And my father, it was basically, again, either you go into rehab or, we cut you off. And I got out of rehab and I relapsed 3 days later. And then I started shooting coke for the first time. And then they moved me to Santa Fe and put me in another, therapeutic environment. And then I moved back to LA and I kept, ending up in the ER and blah, blah, blah. And eventually I got sober in the rooms.
I think one of it is like that helpless feeling. The hardest thing is I have a friend, and I don't know if I have the right to really still call her a friend, but I have a friend back east who's really, really sick, and she's tried and tried and tried, and it's the hardest thing to watch, being in recovery or not, doesn't matter, and that helpless feeling, and that you can't. It's almost like you can't really do much except for make suggestions until someone's absolutely ready.
Yeah. And it's also because
I
addicts are pros at putting people around them on eggshells. Addicts are, like you were saying with your family, like they were scared that if they stopped supporting you, what would you do?
Oh, absolutely.
And
I know how to manipulate
we're like
that.
amazing we have this amazing ability, like, to never talk to you again if you say the wrong thing to us. And that's the fear. You have to be. That's the risk. You have to be willing to get somebody help that maybe they never will talk to you again, because it's better that they're alive than dead.
Yeah.
I don't know if
Absolutely.
tough love always works for everyone. I think some people die doing that. And I'll tell you what worked for me.
I don't disagree.
Some girl called me. A friend of mine had a friend who was sober 3 years, and she had was off of crack, and her parents were convinced she was going to die and had bought a grave plot, and she'd had strokes in her 20s. And she said, just talk to this girl. And I'm totally using at the time. Absolutely. In my house, shooting coke by myself. And I talked to this girl, and she just tells me your story. She doesn't say anything to me. And I just kind of listened. And we talked a couple of days, and then she said, I'm going to go to a meeting. Would you like to meet me there? And I just thought, okay. I mean, I didn't feel any judgment. I felt she understood, and I showed up, and I was shaking and sweating, and I had ace bandages all over my arms. And I kind of it went from there. And that's really what got to me. I'd gone to tons of detoxes. Again, I think you're ready when you're ready. And whatever your bottom is. And for me, my bottom was a health bottom. I mean, I was having grand mal seizures every time I got high. It got really, really, really scary. And I knew I was going to die.
I think, I think whether you're in recovery or you're not, and whether you suffer from this disease or not, if you have a loved one that does, you need to go to Al-Anon.
Because I was talking to somebody about that tonight.
And I think a lot of us, and I'm guilty of it too, because we're in recovery, we think we don't need Al-Anon to deal with other addicts and alcoholics. You know what I mean? But I don't think that's true. You know what I mean? I've learned a lot from the little bit of Al-Anon I've had dealing with people that I would love to see get sober. And if they don't, they're not going to be in my life much longer.